What are studio executives to do after a successful film release but to try to milk it further? When movies do well at the box office, the folks in charge of course want to keep that momentum going. This can often result in a tie-in video game, and spoiler alert, most of them are bad. By this point, I think most people know about the spectacularly terrible adaptation of E.T. the Extraterrestrial. That game was so bad that Atari buried it. Literally. It was nearly enough to kill the video game industry as a whole. But what other movie tie-in games failed to live up to the hype they were based on? These are my bottom 10 cringiest movie tie-in video games. We are starting here for two reasons. One, because this is a fairly well-known example, and two, because it is essentially just a reskin Just Dance, which is not a terrible game. Kinect Star Wars does allegedly have an actual story, which involves players taking the role of Padawans and flailing wildly to use the Force and engage in lightsaber combat. It loosely follows the events leading up to and during the Clone Wars, culminating in the Battle of Coruscant, seen at the beginning of Revenge of the Sith. While it was a somewhat cool idea to have a game that allows players to actually go through Jedi training and become Jedi Knights, this was not a worthwhile execution of that idea. Plus, Jedi Academy already existed. In my opinion, this game was only made because someone made a huge bet on the Kinect and it wasn't paying off. There were two other modes included as well, Rancor Rampage and Galactic Dance-Off. The former has players controlling Rancors and aiming for maximum destruction, while the latter is exactly what it sounds like. As a PlayStation guy myself, I never had to deal with annoying required peripherals in the box, but then again, at least Xbox Live was a fairly reliable online service. This entry is somewhat unique on this list as a game that was based on an already not great adaptation of a pretty wonderful book. Eragon, the movie, was not the most faithful to its source material and feels somewhat hollow as a result. Eragon, the game, was based on that movie, so this problem is only compounded. Weirdly enough, the video game actually came out a month before the film, with most of the same actors playing their roles. Ironically though, Galbatorix is voiced by Neil Dixon in the game despite John Malkovich still being on the cover. It was long for a movie tie-in game, and had a co-op mode that allowed for the main storyline to be completed with a friend. Unfortunately, it also suffered from some funky and sometimes unresponsive controls, and had the graphical fidelity you might expect from a small studio in 2006. Honestly, I remember some good times playing this as a kid, and I did love the movie. In hindsight, at least part of that was probably infatuation with the ghosts of Jack Crusher and Sam Flynn. Enter the Matrix had two things going for it. It was designed and directed as an integral part of the Matrix trilogy, and it followed two great characters that hadn't gotten much screen time. The game's plot takes place roughly around the same time as The Matrix Reloaded, with many familiar characters popping up. It even includes about an hour of live-action footage written and directed by the Wachowskis, which serve as cutscenes. Niobe and Ghost, captain and first officer of the Logos, uncover intelligence of an upcoming attack on Zion by the machines, and Enter the Matrix shows the journey between this moment and their agreeing to help Neo enter the Source. Unfortunately, this game finds itself in this list not because of any story reasons, but because it mechanically barely worked. There were of course complaints from players that they had wanted to play as one of the hero trio, Morpheus, Neo, or Trinity, but the biggest problems were in clunky camera controls and hardware that just couldn't keep up with the film's fight choreography. There really isn't much to say about Charlie's Angels. This beat-em-up was released a full 3 years after the 2000 film reboot of the original 70s TV series. It featured the same angels played by Cameron Diaz, Lucy Liu, and Drew Barrymore, and its release coincided with that of a follow-up film, Charlie's Angels Full Throttle. As a beat-em-up, and as a movie tie-in game, both of which are pretty widely accepted to be simple and not super ambitious, it still manages to stand out. Many say the story is bland, a criticism which is unfortunately shared by the reboot film trilogy. The Angels take on a case after learning that the Statue of Liberty has somehow been stolen. Assuming suspension of disbelief so far, gameplay then begins with Natalie and Alex fighting their way from a swimsuit competition on the beach to the docks. I wish I was kidding. Combine that with clunky mechanics and it's not hard to see why this game is largely forgotten. These ladies deserve better, and this game probably should have never been made. You would think James Cameron's Alien series would translate pretty well to a video game format, and in some cases, you'd be right. In others, however, what you get is a half-baked Call of Duty knockoff complete with that extinction mode from Ghosts. This should be unthinkable for Gearbox, a studio that enjoys world renown for their Borderlands series. But then again, they outsourced a lot of the work on this project to focus resources on Borderlands 2. Aliens Colonial Marines is a first-person shooter with a fairly short campaign that can be played in single-player or co-op mode, as well as a multiplayer PvP mode. The campaign's 11 missions are fairly forgettable linear fights against either xenomorphs or hostile mercenaries. Having played some of the multiplayer myself with friends years ago, I will say playing as a xenomorph can definitely be fun. But the premise gets repetitive, and there are other games that make being a xenomorph feel even better. I do wonder what this game could have been like if it had been given more dedicated attention. Moving into the bottom 5, here's a game that I'm willing to bet a fair amount of you didn't even know existed. The 2003 first-person shooter RoboCop was difficult to find despite being technically released on 4 platforms. Each region it was released in only got 1 or 2 of those platforms, which contributed to the scarcity. North America specifically only received the Xbox version, with others receiving some combination of PC, PS2, and GameCube. Distribution issues aside, the game also experienced many schedule pushes due to development changing hands multiple times. Gameplay reflects this, with visuals, gameplay, and difficulty all being subpar. As with most of these games in different ways, controls were clunky and movement was slow. Critics also noted an abundance of enemies, a lack of cover, and limited weapons and ammo. However you feel about the original RoboCop films, this was a game that clearly tried to do them justice but couldn't quite get there. Just why? We'll spend a bit longer here because there are 7 different versions of the Home Alone game across 8 different platforms. Ordinarily, this would merit separate entries, but each of these versions were released within less than a 2-year time frame. They also all follow basically the same plot, just using different mechanics. In order of release, let's take a look. 3 Nintendo systems and 2 computers got a version of the game in 1991. Both the SNES and Game Boy versions include a mechanic where the player must collect valuables from around the McAllister house and drop them down a laundry chute. This leads to boss fights with rats, spiders, and ghosts among other things before Kevin can lock the valuables in the family safe. Weird premise, but what the hell, we'll allow it. This was the 90s after all. The NES and PC versions function almost like a combination RTS and tower defense game. Essentially, the goal is to set traps, like what are seen in the film, to incapacitate Marv and Harry. Game over conditions ensue when Kevin is incapacitated by the Wet Bandits, which in the Amiga and MS-DOS versions is a single close encounter. Sega systems had 2 slightly differing versions of the game. The Genesis and Game Gear had Kevin protecting the entire neighborhood, moving from house to house, harassing Marv and Harry. Using weapons like his BB gun, and traps if he is able to enter a house before the bandits, Kevin must protect each home's valuables. The Master System uses similar ideas but breaks the houses into 30 separate levels with 6 potential layouts. Pets, either a cat or dog, are also present in each house that can be used to the player's advantage. Despite all these different versions, or actually more likely because of them, the game is pretty universally derided. Critics panned it as underdeveloped and slow, even for a licensed game. The Sega versions did fare a bit better critically, but still suffered from lackluster sales. Home Alone was created to appeal to kids who had watched the film, in much the same way that Happy Meal toys were. Still can't believe Bethesda made the NES version. First rule of Fight Club is...
You do not talk about Fight Club.
Oh, how I wish I could abide by that rule. Fight Club was easily the most divisive film of 1999, but it has since become a cult classic. The same cannot be said for the 2004 video game adaptation. It is, as you should expect, a fighting game. Many of its mechanics and visual elements were borrowed from other, less realistic fighting games of the time, including Tekken 4 and Mortal Kombat Deception. Speaking of mechanics, the game had one idea that I actually think is kinda interesting. Characters could sustain real injuries such as a broken arm that could impair their performance. Hardcore mode takes this even further with successive fights. In this mode, any injuries will be sustained in subsequent fights as well, which can result in a character being too injured to continue. Unlike a lot of licensed video games, which tend to at least get either the license part or the game part somewhat right, Fight Club was dismissed by everyone. Fans of the book and film mostly saw the game as a cash grab, and critics saw it as unoriginal and repetitive. Fight Club did technically have a story mode with an unnamed protagonist, which also happens to be how players can unlock Fred Durst as a playable character. Because of course. No hate to Limp Bizkit though, they've got some good shit, and Break Stuff does fit this premise very well. For anyone who doesn't know, Durst is made into a playable character in any game that licenses his band's music per his own demands. Bet you haven't heard of this one. Why would you, given that it came out over 2 decades after the first movie? There was technically another Beverly Hills Cop game released much closer to the actual films in 1990, which didn't really impress reviewers either. But the 2006 game was much worse. For perspective, this is the game's Wikipedia page. This title bafflingly did not use Eddie Murphy's likeness for Axel Foley, and instead replaced him with this discount Agent 47 wearing the wrong Letterman jacket. Everything about this game, down to the main title since they didn't even get Harold Faltermeyer's Axel F., just feels wrong. It's a first-person shooter released exclusively in the EU for the PS2 that can be completed in as little as 3 hours according to IGN. I don't even really want to take the time talking about the story on this one, which is a good thing considering there's basically zero information about it anywhere. When it comes to clunky games, this one has to be near the top of the list. It has been noted as having beyond subpar graphics and animations, bad AI and hit detection, and a functionally useless conversation mechanic that was supposed to be a major selling point according to the game's packaging. For reference, 2006 also happened to see the release of the PlayStation 3, and Beverly Hills Cop preempted the release of games like BioShock, Halo 3, and COD 4 by only a year. There is much more that could be said about this game, but I know I'm going to have a hard time finding footage for this segment as it is, and beating a dead horse just isn't worth it. For a game that could have fit on and looks like it was made for an arcade cabinet, you're better off playing some Galaga instead. You didn't think all of these were going to be 90s and early 2000s games, did you? Let's take a look at something a bit more recent with a somehow even more fucked up looking Smeagol. As someone who loves The Lord of the Rings, I don't particularly think an expansion of the story following Gollum between the events of The Hobbit and Fellowship of the Ring was really necessary. But that aside, the game wasn't even good. It was actually rated by Metacritic as the worst game of 2023. This isn't hyperbole. The company responsible for the game, Daedalic Entertainment, actually shuttered its development division as a direct result of this game's performance. Like many of the other games in this list, Gollum suffers from sloppy movement and platforming, as well as general instability and crashes. Then of course, there's the paid DLC debacle. If you don't already know, I'm not talking about a story expansion or exclusive equipment. This DLC, also included in the Precious version of the game, adds more Sindarin voice lines to the game. That's it. And the base game already includes lines where elves speak their native language. Adding this DLC was a baffling choice, and charging for it is insulting. Overall, despite what many praise as an actually interesting and worthwhile story, Gollum does little but frustrate the player. In the words of a reviewer whose headline I quite enjoyed, The Lord of the Rings Gollum is a nasty little game. Let me know if you have any differing opinions or if I missed any questionable cash grabs. Just don't start a fight in my comments. Please like the video if you enjoyed and join the family if you want to see more nerdy shit like this. You can also find me across social media under the same name. Remember, love recklessly. Start with yourself.